In April 2005, a single grainy photograph quietly dismantled one of Hollywood's most carefully maintained illusions. A paparazzi lens captured Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie strolling barefoot along a secluded beach in Kenya. The image was not dramatic, yet it carried devastating clarity. For Jennifer Aniston, it was the moment tabloid speculation hardened into undeniable truth. For 5 years, she and Pitt had been framed as Hollywood's golden couple, symbols of stability in an industry built on impermanence. Their relationship was treated less like a marriage and more like a brand, polished and protected. When that photograph surfaced, it did not just end a relationship, it ended a fantasy the public had emotionally invested in. Yet what followed was unexpected. There were no public meltdowns, no explosive interviews, no scorched earth retaliation. Instead, Aniston chose something far more powerful: composure. This was not merely a story of heartbreak, but the opening chapter in how one woman endured the most public betrayal of her era without surrendering her dignity, voice, or self-definition. In the weeks after the separation, public appetite leaned toward spectacle. Many expected tears, rage, or collapse. Instead, Aniston delivered one of the most controlled moments of exposure in celebrity history through a single interview with Vanity Fair. When she referenced Pitt's apparent lack of a sensitivity chip, the phrase detonated culturally. It wasn't cruel, loud, or vindictive, it was precise. With one line, she reframed the divorce not as scandal, but as emotional neglect. She did not accuse him of infidelity, she accused him of emotional absence. That distinction shifted the narrative permanently. Pitt was no longer framed as a villain, but as a man dangerously disconnected from the consequences of his actions. The brilliance of the remark lay in its restraint. Aniston exposed him without humiliating herself. She spoke calmly, thoughtfully, and without bitterness, marking the moment she transformed from tabloid casualty into narrator of her own truth. The sensitivity chip was not gossip, it was diagnosis. To understand why Aniston's words cut so deeply, one must examine the timing. While she was privately grieving the dissolution of her marriage, Pitt was starring in a 60-page editorial for W magazine titled Domestic Bliss. The spread featured Pitt and Jolie styled as a retro suburban family, surrounded by children in a fictionalized fantasy of domestic perfection. The images were released while divorce paperwork was still underway. For Aniston, this was not simply hurtful, it was revealing. The exposure wasn't about an affair, it was about the absence of empathy required to publicly debut a new life before formally closing the old one. Her criticism of the shoot as inappropriate wasn't jealousy, it was moral clarity. She exposed a pattern. Pitt had emotionally exited the marriage long before the paperwork caught up. The sensitivity chip comment was not a joke, it was a surgical observation of how easily he had transitioned from husband to protagonist of a new narrative, leaving emotional wreckage behind. Long before Kenya, the marriage was unraveling quietly. The final season of Friends in 2004 marked the end of Aniston's emotional anchor just as her personal life began to fracture. As castmates leaned on their partners during the final weeks of filming, Pitt was notably absent. He did not attend the final taping. Instead, he was in Morocco filming Mr. and Mrs. Smith. At the time, the absence seemed minor. In hindsight, it was a warning sign. Aniston was saying goodbye to a decade-long work family while returning to a home growing colder by the day. This period exposed the most painful kind of loneliness, the kind that exists while still married. Her later reflections suggest a man who had already checked out, emotionally relocating before physically leaving. The marriage didn't end on a beach, it ended in dressing rooms and empty houses, where one partner was preparing for reinvention while the other was still building a home. When the internal decay became public, the media filled the silence with a narrative that was easy to sell and brutal to endure. Aniston was cast as the career-obsessed woman who didn't want children, while Pitt was framed as the family-oriented man seeking fulfillment elsewhere. This storyline dominated headlines for years. The truth, revealed much later, was far more painful. During the exact period her marriage was unraveling, Aniston was undergoing private IVF treatments. While tabloids portrayed her as selfish, she was quietly struggling to build the family she was accused of rejecting. This exposure wasn't about Pitt, it was about systemic sexism. Hollywood punished her for not performing motherhood on schedule while protecting the man who left. The industry turned her silence into evidence against her, proving how easily women's pain is rewritten as personal failure. This lie would linger for 2 decades before finally being dismantled. The divorce did not simply become news, it became infrastructure. The Team Jen versus Team Angelina phenomenon transformed personal devastation into a consumer spectacle. Boutiques sold allegiance on t-shirts. Paparazzi stalked Aniston relentlessly, hunting for proof of sadness. Her pain became a commodity, generating millions for magazines like People and Us Weekly. Meanwhile, Pitt's transformation into half of Brangelina was framed as evolution, not betrayal. The double standard was stark. He was allowed reinvention, she was frozen in grief. By positioning Aniston as the eternal victim, the media stripped her of agency while shielding Pitt from accountability. The architecture of this war depended on female rivalry, ensuring the man at the center remained largely untouched. It was not journalism, it was exploitation, and Aniston was the raw material. What ultimately dismantled the machine was Aniston's refusal to participate. She declined the emotional tell-alls the media demanded. She refused to cry on command. Instead, she chose silence, not as weakness, but as resistance. By not feeding the narrative, she exposed the industry's dependence on her pain. This decision quietly changed celebrity crisis management forever. Before Aniston, divorces were scandals to bury. After her, they became brands to manage. Her restraint starved the spectacle. The public, deprived of drama, was forced to sit with the reality of her composure. In doing nothing, she did everything. She reclaimed narrative control not through confrontation, but endurance. The industry had expected her to break. Instead, she waited it out, and won. Aniston's transformation from tabloid subject to industry mogul was deliberate. Acting roles like the breakup allowed her to process heartbreak publicly, but the real shift happened behind the scenes. She exited Plan B Entertainment, the company she co-founded with Pitt, and began building independently. Through Echo Films and later ventures, she curated stories centered on female complexity and emotional realism. She sold the home that symbolized her failed marriage and rebuilt her life on her own terms. Strategic brand partnerships reframed her image from tragic to aspirational. This was not revenge, it was autonomy. She stopped trying to correct the narrative and started outgrowing it. Time reshaped everything. By the early 2020s, Pitt publicly acknowledged his failures, admitting to emotional absence and substance abuse. At the 2020 SAG Awards, a brief backstage interaction between the former couple symbolized closure. Years later, Aniston described the drama as worn out, no longer relevant. In 2025, she finally revealed the IVF struggles she endured in silence, dismantling the cruel fertility myth once and for all. The exposure arrived not through anger, but truth. Pitt's accountability validated what she had always implied: the marriage didn't fail because she wasn't enough, it failed because he wasn't present. Today, Jennifer Aniston stands not as a survivor, but as an author of her own life. She is a producer, entrepreneur, and cultural constant whose success is rooted in longevity, not nostalgia. Pitt remains a powerful figure, but their narratives no longer intersect. Aniston didn't win by replacing him, she won by refusing to let the past define her future. She exposed not just one man's flaws, but an industry's obsession with women's pain. Her legacy is not resilience alone, but authorship. She reclaimed her story, proving that the most powerful response to betrayal is not retaliation, but transcendence.